Right, so I'm James Lawson. I'm the chairman of the Adam Smith Institute, and I am delighted to welcome you all tonight to the first of our Enlightenment Evenings. I think there was a reflection post the pandemic that emerging from the depths of that crisis, we didn't return to normal with the same volume and quality of events that we used to have. And we thought it would be worth initiating a new series where in the evenings we're able to take out a little bit of time to talk about the serious issues of the day, to have a new series where we interview policy experts, academics, authors on the various topics that are stirring up Westminster and beyond. And our most recent research report certainly caused a bit of a stir. You may have heard it on LBC, you may have read it in the papers. It was definitely watched by millions on TV, and if you're what the kids call terminally online, you may have seen a bit of angst on Twitter as well. So in short-term thinking, we looked at the economics of applying VAT to independent school fees and outlined a number of significant concerns and potential negative consequences for our education system, our economy, and our society. Before we get started, just a little bit of housekeeping. I'll be chairing the discussion for no more than half an hour, probably less, after which we'll move to a very brief Q&A, which I will also chair, and we'll also try and keep that brief and move back to drinks, and you'll be able to speak to the author directly. But if you have any burning questions, save them up right for the end rather than heckling midway through. A few other housekeeping items. If there's a fire, please exit downstairs. And if you want to come to more ASI events coming up shortly, we have David Friedman, who's really, really wonderful. We've hosted him before, son of the great Milton Friedman, but not just known for being his son. He's a renowned academic of his own right, and that's on the 25th of April. Location to be confirmed, but very close to here. And then for those of you who are under the age of 35, we have our next generation group event on the 9th of April, and that will be with a guest from Politico, Sasha O'Sullivan. So really looking forward to that. But without further ado, let's get into the discussion of tonight's Enlightenment Evening. And let me introduce you to Maxwell Marlowe, not only the author of the report, but also our Director of Research, who looks after all of the research at the ASI. So Maxwell, let's get started. Firstly, I think many commentators seem to think that the question of what would happen if VAT was applied to independent schools, to private schools, was a completely settled topic. And they believe that it would have a very positive impact, that it would raise a significant amount of money for the Exchequer. Why did you decide to look at this topic more closely?
Yeah, so education is really important. I don't know if anyone's realised that before. Everyone's gone through school, and I just thought, I've seen so many numbers floating around, and all this debate het up about what to do about private schools. Is it iniquitous? Is it, bad for society? But most of all, is it bad for the country? And are we missing out by not taxing it? So I thought, hey, let's have a proper look at the numbers. And the only source I could find was the Institute for Fiscal Studies, which in itself is, a very good source. It's used by the government, it's used by a number of businesses, but I found their report lacking. So I thought, hey, let's have a proper dig in. And what I was concerned about, mostly, James, was that it was very static. A lot of the data coming out and the models they used were old. There's a certain study they used to model the migration effect from applying VAT, applying additional costs to school fees and what happens to the students afterwards. It's called Dynasky. It's a 2003 study looking at Catholic schools with sibling discounts. That's a really small study. It's from another country, from another decade. We've moved on since then. So I didn't think they handled that properly. And I thought we could really branch out and have a proper look at what would happen to the sector, both private and state, and what would happen to the families, the staff and the schools involved, really dig into those numbers.
It's a good reason to write another piece of research. So the figures that suggest it will raise money seem to be based on a very particular premise. And that premise is that 3 to 5% of pupils in independent schools will move to state sector. So a very small number of people will move from the independent sector to the state sector. Your paper looks at a range of scenarios and suggests that up to 25% could migrate. Why have you included such a high figure? Why have you included other figures?
Yeah, so because of the lack of evidence, the independent school system has commissioned other research into this, and I thought that's worth looking into. Now, we look at everything from 0%, so if you do apply the tax and no one moves, that'd be very interesting. That'd be also unique in economics. All the way up to 25%, which is by a bit of research by the consultancy Baines Cutler. So I think it's important for policymakers when they're meddling with education and really trying to make policy and fiscal decisions around it, they have a whole range of options to look at. So that's why I used the 25% report. I don't think it's a great report, to be honest. They take a very small sample study, the methodology is very unclear, but I still think we should look at what would happen if 25% happened, because a lot of economics is about the ifs, not about the certainties. So that's why I included those, and that's garnered a little bit of criticism. Okay, fine, but the whole point is that we're supposed to critique the numbers. So that's why I included that little bit outlandish figure, but nonetheless still relevant.
So I think it's fair to say that you weren't saying 25% would definitely migrate, which I think some people leapt upon and used that as a way to try and discredit your research, but instead you were looking at a number of scenarios, as you say, from 0 to 25. But then, may I put you on the spot, what percentage of pupils do you think will actually migrate from independent schools to the state sector, and what sort of impact do you think it will have?
We don't know, and I'm going to be very clear that we don't know, and I won't claim omniscience to know. The data is sparse. We're looking at 600,000 children in private education. That's at least 300,000 adults, if not more. All of their income, all of their savings, whether or not they can draw on money from remortgaging their house to cutting costs day-to-day life, borrowing off family members and friends. That's too much data, even for great institutions like the IFS to look at. So I don't know. Intuition, which again is I think quite important, I think about 10% would leave. We're in the middle of a cost of living crisis. Private school fees have been rising, indeed above inflation, to catch up a lot of costs. And I think adding 20% overnight could really cause a lot of damage. And it'd be quite a shock to the system. So I think about 10 to 15%. And what that means for the numbers, the amount raised, it doesn't raise a penny. In fact, it probably costs in the low hundreds of thousands, low hundreds of millions essentially, for the exchequer to facilitate that move over in the lost downstream tax effects that happen. So that's everything from payroll to supply chains, and as we'll come on to later, I'm sure, what happens to parents who are working and don't want to work anymore to pay for those fees. So that's really what I was looking at there, and 10 to 15% I think is the most likely scenario, which isn't included in the IFS study or in any of the numbers being pointed around by the department just over the road.
I think that's very fair. I just add or re-emphasise, one, in a cost of living crisis, it's really, really, really hard to suddenly absorb a huge additional cost if you're a parent, particularly if you've got more than one child. And I think more broadly, the UK has been in a position where there's been very limited economic growth for over a decade now. Productivity has been fairly stagnant since 2008. So we're not in a position where that rise in school fees and potential additional sharp rise in school fees can simply be ignored. But what do you make of the argument that many have made that independent schools will just absorb the costs? Because there's an assumption here that the reason parents will migrate their kids from independent schools to the state sector is the cost goes up. But what if the cost doesn't go up? What if the independent sector just absorb this cost and don't pass it on and don't pass VAT on to the parents?
Well, we know that's not going to happen. So there's two things to answer that question. All independent schools are not Eton, Harrow, Winchester. They're not all part of the Harrow group, right? They are placed up and down the country. Some are very small. In fact, a great number are very small, less than less than 1,000 students, right? Which is quite inconceivable for a great deal of the state sector in this country. They're not sitting on massive reserves. They do invest a lot of money in capital, so that's stuff like theatre, redoing their theatre, doing sports fields, laboratories, libraries, stuff like this. That's been in the past, but now with that lack of money, they're going to have to start cutting, and they'll start cutting quite hard. I think the Oxford Economics did a study into what would happen if there are changes to income, and what you'd find is there are about 5,000 teachers would have to be cut, or they'd cut bursaries, or they'd cut other costs in other areas, so you'd have more cramped classrooms, the school's less competitive, etc., etc. There is not a single example really of complete cost absorption in anywhere in economics that you could transcribe over to the private sector. And coming to the second part is the Telegraph today released a poll looking at they asked loads and loads and loads of schools, private schools, what will they do if this policy was to come into place? They'd raise fees. Many, or in fact the vast majority, over 90%, by over 10%, which could again be out of the price range for many families. So I think if you look at the evidence that's been supplied today from Telegraph, we will see not cost absorption, but passing on the cost to parents, and those parents may not be able to afford the increase.
I'll just add a couple of observations. I think firstly, a lot of schools, independent schools in this country, are non-profits, but if you look at the profit margins of for-profit schools, they operate on a very, very limited margin, and we can assume the same is true of non-profits reinvesting their surplus back into the schools. So a 15-20% rise is going to have a significant impact for sure. The other thing I've noted over the last 10-15 years with independent schools is a massive increase in their schemes with state schools, with the local communities, making, if they have a performance arts centre, making that available to the local community and hosting events, and also a lot more bursaries. It's been springing up across a lot of schools where they are trying to move towards the American model of needs-blind education, where they raise sufficient charitable funds that they can put kids in for free. And I think if it doesn't take the effect of a price rise, it will certainly take the effect of cutting the number of bursaries that they're able to offer, because somewhere the buck's got to give.
I agree with that, and I think it's been interesting to see that for-profit schools have been very quiet about this, because they know their charitable sector colleagues and competitors. Remember, this is a market; there are competitors. The non-profits won't be able to afford this. A lot of them may actually have to close down, and the for-profit schools, they're sitting quite nicely actually. They're allowed to make a profit, they're allowed to distribute dividends and to their shareholders. They will see the migration effect coming to them. So I think that's a really important point, is that actually we do have a lot of charitable schools. There are a lot of critics are saying, these schools operate like businesses. Of course not charities. Charities also operate like businesses. Oxfam doesn't just operate, like a mum and pop charity doing lots of volunteering work. So they own shops, they own massive programs. There's a lot of cost involved going there. Charities are like businesses, except the education is a public good. Both in the immediate outcome and for the rest of us. We all free ride off other people's education. So it's really important to keep that in mind on this particular issue, is that for-profit schools may be quite happy about this.
As a trustee of an educational research charity, I love donations from you all to the Adam Smith Institute. But moving swiftly on to the paper, one unintended consequence that you touch upon is teacher redundancies. Why was that included? Won't they just be rehired by the state sector?
Well, there's a possibility of that. So we currently have about 2,600 spaces, about 2,600 vacancies in the state sector. As I cited earlier, the Oxford Economics report, which is quite robust, looks at about over 5,000 teachers being made redundant. The ability for the state sector to suddenly move and capture those is very hard. If anyone here tried to deal with the state sector ever, it doesn't move very quickly. So having a large amount of teachers leave, and as I said earlier, they'll be cutting costs in the private sector, that's going to be very difficult. So we do look at that withdrawal of supply. It's also the fact that there is kind of an elasticity of supply in this area. Teachers want to teach in private schools. There's a reason there are fewer children in the classes. The facilities may be nicer. It may be in their local area. They may have moved to do that job. There may be nice workplace benefits they don't get elsewhere. It could be down to their age as well. So if you're in your late 50s and you think, I've got to try another school now, you may choose to retire early. Pay is better in the private sector. All of these reasons, and all these reasons that aren't really looked at by other reports into this. That's really important. And people say, oh, of course, the elasticity of supply is perfectly elastic. It's not. It's quite inelastic, which means teachers won't want to move around. So that's why we will see a lot of teachers becoming unemployed, and they may not want to re-enter the state sector. And we have a hiring crisis in the state sector for teachers.
It's quite a wonky way of saying basically teachers won't be rehired.
Yes.
Sorry. So advocates of applying VAT have said that it could be used to fund improvements in the state sector. How do you respond to that?
Well, look, as I said earlier, if 10 to 15% of students leave the private sector, then it raises no money. So immediately you're there, not raising any money and not spending any money. So you have to raise taxes elsewhere or borrow, which I know is not within fiscal rules of certain parties who are looking to maybe come into power. But again, the 1.3 to 1.6 billion pounds that's put by the IFS is only 2% of the education department's budget. It's really not going. It's not going to hit the sides, especially in a burgeoning system which is, which is looking to, increase pay for teachers, increase standards, deal with the concrete crisis. All of these different things. This money is, it's been alleged, it's been spent multiple times over. Even if it hasn't, it's not going to touch the sides. We won't see the capacity increase. So that I just don't see it happening.
Yeah. Another angle of criticism for this paper. Yeah. Another angle is that you risk is the fact that you included risks to parents and the impact on the labour supply there. So this is the idea that parents who are working extra hard to put their kids through private schools might stop doing so, might take on other jobs. What does it mean? Why did you include this? What do you think about this?
Yeah. So why do people get paid for work? Is the first question. It's because labour is a disutility. People want to live in the Marxist wonderland where they work for a third of the day, read philosophy another third, and then go hunting in the last third. People must be paid for their labour. It's a disutility. People don't inherently want to work. So therefore, you'll see parents who are taking multiple jobs or side jobs, whatever else, to pay for these things, to pay for these fees. They will leave the labour force. They'll leave the workforce. Whether that's through putting second or third jobs, whether that's through leaving their job anyway. My mum always talks about me growing up. So I grew up in Tooting Beck. She took on an entire job to pay for my childcare. But if the childcare was cheaper, she tells me she wouldn't get a job. I'm sure this is reflected across the economy. So we also take into account the fiscal outcomes of people leaving the labour supply. And that's hard. That's very hard to model. But the numbers we've come to, it shows even more costs for the state in downstream tax receipts.
Right. And overall, do you think we can predict the impact on social mobility of this?
Yeah, I think we can. It's not going to be good. As you said earlier, James, schools offer a lot of support to state schools who don't have the money to supply things like drama, things like art, sports. So that's an immediate thing. The social mobility isn't just in the classic humanities or sciences. It's kind of all over the place, and private schools do help with this stuff. The other thing is the bursaries argument, as you touched on. Bursaries are really helpful, and a lot of schools offer very generous, even complete bursaries on a needs tested basis. The first thing to go are going to be those charitable aspects under class, right? Because you can't give up the core supply of your revenue, which are students paying to go, so the other costs must go. So yes, we will see quite a negative effect on social mobility.
Okay. And then a last couple of questions just to reflect on its impact so far and some more of the feedback. The ASI has historically argued against exemptions from VAT being removed. And for the base of that tax to be as broad as possible. Aren't you arguing the opposite in this paper?
I am, because education, as I put in the paper, isn't restaurants or dishwashers. They're not. It's not a general consumption. VAT, our friends down the road will probably say, yes, of course, we must levy VAT on everything, and if we broaden the base, the tax will fall. does anyone trust politicians enough to lower the tax on everything? I don't. Unfortunately, it is in this government, even if it was some time ago, that they increased the rate of VAT, and they'll keep doing it. So yes, I agree. The tax system is very complicated, and it's painful to have to advocate, and show some research to show that actually we shouldn't be. Broadening that base, but I really do think that education is such a valuable public good that taxing it doesn't make any sense. And let's remind ourselves here, under European law, I know we don't talk about it, but European law, it is illegal to tax education. You're not allowed to do it. Greece tried to under their financial crisis, and we saw what the economists called general mayhem. So they put 23% VAT on private school fees. Loads of the small schools closed. The big schools obviously didn't. They were okay. And there was a large flood of students going into the state sector, and the state couldn't respond. So there was a lot of kids who just weren't in school and weren't being educated. So I think you can take the libertarian principle of saying, yes, if we are going to have tax, we should levy it on everything and broaden the base. Or you can have what is a highly dysfunctional system, which would be the case if we added VAT onto these schools.
Got it. The paper's been out for a week now. Have your views changed in any way? Have any of the conversations influenced your opinion? Has any new evidence come out in the media discussion that's worth particularly highlighting? Anything that you would emphasise differently of any aspects of the paper?
Yeah. So my views have changed. It's made me more. I feel more strongly about this than I did, when I published it last week. Essentially, there are so many parents who are not just calling into LBC or writing letters into newspapers or leaving comments on LinkedIn or on Twitter. That people are scared. People are really scared about their children, and that's something you don't want to put parents through. So I feel more, I feel more secure in the argument made, the evidence we produced, which is all again open source, publicly available data. So what I have found as well is that people run to certain think tanks as kind of the golden cow of economics, and I think that's really dangerous. As we show in the paper, we try to build on the IFS and build out their report, and people have just gone straight back to that report and said, no, you're wrong. Well, in our report, we've broadened the base of evidence, and we've shown that there's areas to improve, but other people haven't done it. And it was quite interesting for me to see some critics show, oh yes, this IFS report has said this, and we say, yes, we know if you've read the paper, and none of them have read the paper. So that's been quite concerning for me, from a policy-making point of view, is that our policymakers aren't reading the policy work. Yep. They're reading the tweets and the op-eds.
I'll end on your critics and the tweets. I was reading feedback on the paper on the way here. In my inbox, I have some very positive contributions, including from some parents, which is quite nice to read. It's rare that you get that kind of feedback on a policy paper in Westminster. But I also saw some interesting tweets. One from a former speaker at an ASI event who said, "What happened to the ASI? When did they give up entirely on economics?"
I know who you're talking about. That he's actually quite a famous donor to the IEA after losing a bet with Christopher Snowdon over economics. So I think our badge of being an economical think tank, a neoliberal think tank, is still perfectly fine, and we've got quite a dynamic model to show what would happen. If you choose not to read the paper, more for you.
Let's move to some brief Q&A. I would like to take, if there are questions, I'd like to take them in a grouping.